Hey everybody, welcome back to the AP World History Review Sessions. As always, my name is Mason Logereau, coming to you from the great state of Texas, where we just found out that schools are going to be closed until at least May 4th. So I know some of you found out that you're going to be online schooling for the rest of the year. Some of us are still waiting, but we are May 4th. And then when I told my son that, he looked straight at me and said, "May the 4th be with you." And I was proud, of course, because he's making the joke in the Star Wars line. But at the same time, I got a little upset because, okay, I'm the father of the family. I should be the one making really bad dad jokes with really bad puns. And he kind of stole my thunder. And then I just got sad. But oh well, I will make it through today. So, what are we going to look at today? We're actually kind of making a transition here from Unit 8 to Unit 9. So we're not going to be talking Cold War anymore. We're not going to be talking decolonization anymore. Instead, Unit 9 is really all about globalization. How has the world shrunk over the last 120 years? And we're going to start looking at that today by analyzing some of the new technologies that have come around the last 120 years that have really changed social and economic structures all around the world. We need to talk about how it has made life better, no doubt, but we also need to look at the drawbacks and the limitations of technology, including, yes, we're going to talk about the spread of disease. We are going to talk about global pandemics today. I know you've heard plenty about it the last couple of weeks, but I actually do want to kind of put what's going on right now into historical context. And we're also going to talk about the impact on the environment that a lot of these technologies have had. I also want to go a little bit deeper into comparing, contrasting, and also continuities and changes over time. Mr. Smith did a really good lesson last week where he's doing some comparing, contrasting. So I'm going to kind of follow up on that and talk about continuities and changes. And I really want to look at those today and talk about how it's going to help you when you're studying, because you have an AP test next month and you need to start preparing for it. And if you start kind of thinking of history as comparing, contrasting, and continuities and changes, I think it's really going to help organize all the information in your brain. So I'll talk about that some today as well. Now, as far as what you need to know before we start today, first off, you need to understand our world today. What is life like in 2020 on Earth? This is one of those moments where we're going to actually kind of start with the end in mind and look and see how we got here through the 1900s into the 21st century. And then again, you should be able at this point to be able to identify similarities and differences and identify continuities and changes. That's something your teacher has probably worked with you all year on. But I want to go a little bit further with that today and talk about how we explain it, look for the reasons behind it, do a little analysis of it. All right, so let's start with yesterday's homework that you had from Mr. Smith. He gave you 3 claims to make, or that he made, excuse me, about the end of the Cold War, and he was looking for evidence that would support those claims. And then, like he said, for bonus points, you could, of course, go further with that and write a full paragraph to do it. So I kind of jotted down a couple of ideas of topics you could have talked about if you're going to support these claims that he made. Again, as we keep saying over and over, talk to your teacher. If you have something different, get that individualized feedback. They want to hear from you. They actually kind of miss you. So claim number 1, that it was military and technological development by the United States that led to the end of the Cold War. And Smith talked about this yesterday with the Strategic Defensive Initiative, i.e. Star Wars, and the fact that the Soviet Union was also spending a lot of money on technology towards the end of their time, and that ends up sort of essentially bankrupting their economy. Claim number 2 is that the Soviet Union's failed invasion in Afghanistan led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you could definitely make that argument. The failures of the Soviets in Afghanistan showed their military weakness, showed their technology weaknesses. It showed that simply they were not prepared for the type of guerrilla warfare that they faced in Afghanistan. And the cost of the war, and by the way, I'm not just talking about the economic costs, I'm also talking about the cost in lives. Very high casualty rates for the Soviets through the 80s in Afghanistan. And that again put more strains on the Soviet economy. And as that war continued, public support for it declined very quickly, and public support for the government also declined. You could also say there was discontent and economic weakness in the Soviet Union and in those satellite countries of Eastern Europe. And I would definitely talk about that. You start to see the beginnings, kind of small scale rebellions in Eastern Europe. And then, of course, Smith talked a long time talking about glasnost and perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts at reform of the Soviet Union that didn't quite take off and work out. By the way, if you did miss yesterday's session, please, please, please go back and watch that at some point and pay special attention to glasnost and perestroika, because those are very important. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Let's get into that. Before we do, I want you to do a little brainstorming here and think about technologies or technological developments that were developed in the 20th century. So from 1900 to the year 2000. So I'm going to give you about 1 minute. I want you to list as many as you can. If you want to have a piece of paper, jot them down. If you're on your computer, open something up and type it up real quick. Just make sure you got a list going of as many different technologies as you can think of that came about in the 20th century. If you want some bonus points, and again, I can't give you bonus points, but let's pretend like I can, okay? Then I want you to try to identify an impact that that technology had. What was the effect of that technology on the world's societies or economies or government structures or any of that? Okay, so take 1 minute, list as many as you can, give effects if you can, ready, go. All right, you got 30 seconds. Keep writing as many as you can. All right, pencils down, stop writing. I am very curious as to what you wrote. I would like to see it. Unfortunately, we can't do that. But I can give you a list of technologies that are extremely important from the 20th century. And I kind of broke them down into 4 main categories. And you definitely need to know these. Again, you probably have different ones. That's totally cool. We could have spent the next hour talking about new technologies in the 20th century because there are a lot of them. But let's talk about these major ones. First off, we see huge leaps when it comes to communication. All right, the advent of radio. Radio becomes popular around the world, kind of, depending on where you're talking about in the world, in the 1920s or so. That's a huge moment. We've talked about the importance of mass media already. If you think about radio and then later television coming about in the 1950s and 60s, and how that helps spread news around the world much, much quicker, gives governments the ability to voice things to their citizens much quicker. That was a major advancement. But really, I think the biggest one is the internet. And the internet really becomes widely used, and I'd say like the late 1990s and into the 21st century, of course. But the late 1990s for a lot of people were when they first discovered the internet. And guys, I just want you to really consider how much that changed everything in the world. I mean, right now, I am talking to you over the internet. I am sitting in a room in the back of my house, and I'm able to reach thousands of students and teach them about world history because of the internet. And by the way, it's not too difficult. I've got kind of a cheap laptop open. I've got my little camera. I've got my really cool headphones with microphone. and I'm able to reach tons of people around the country and around the world. That wouldn't have been available to us 30, 40 years ago. So the internet really changes how people communicate and really brings the world together. And it can be used for entertainment as well. I mean, really, I just want y'all to consider, you've been stuck at home now for a couple of weeks, a lot of you. Think about how much you've relied on the internet these last couple of weeks. I'm just gonna tell you right now, I don't want to be like old man shaking my fist at the clouds and all that. But back in my day, and it's back in the 80s, before we had the internet, if we had had a global pandemic where everyone was forced to stay home for weeks, it would have been brutal. Guys, I had like 12 channels on my television growing up, and 3 of those were networks, and my mom would have been watching soap operas all day. But now you've got Netflix, you've got Hulu, you've got all the different websites, you've got the internet to talk to friends. It's made things so much easier. And then, of course, cell phones as well. Really, when you consider cell phones and what amazing invention those are, just kind of consider the fact that each of you in your pocket right now has a device that is small enough to fit in your pocket. It's cheap enough that everyone can buy one. Okay, I mean, I get it. Nice smartphones are expensive, but for most people, they're within their budget. And you can use that to communicate with anyone in the world you want. Or you can use it to access information on any topic you possibly want. That's really insane when you put that in the scope of world history. So communication has obviously drawn the world together and made the world much smaller. We can instantaneously communicate with anybody we want around the world. When it comes to energy, think about the forms of energy that humans have harnessed throughout history. Early in history, it was either human power or animal power. Later, people figured out wind power. Of course, sailboats used wind power to harness. When it comes time for the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see, of course, steam engines being a big kind of push in energy and forms of energy. And that's a big moment because, of course, humans now have more energy that they can harness and use than ever before. But then in the 20th century, we start to figure out petroleum and oil. And of course, in the mid-1900s, atomic and nuclear power. And now we have forms of power that we've never had in history before and that we can use in everyday life. You use all these different types of energy to travel, to get goods delivered, to run our homes and businesses. So we have more energy that we can harness than ever before. When it comes to food production, the Green Revolution in the 1950s and 60s is a really big turning point in agriculture. And the Green Revolution, it's not just one thing. It's things like new types of pesticides to get rid of bugs that would be eating crops, hybrid crops that are a lot more resistant to things like drought. And the end result is more food here on Earth than we've ever had before. And of course, that supports a higher population because there's more people on the Earth than ever before. But the Green Revolution is a really important point because it really does help to end famines around the world. Yes, there are still problems of famine. But really, if you look at examples in the 20th century, a lot of times those are man-made famines. Like, for example, Stalin's policies in the Soviet Union that kept food from large regions. I mean, bottom line is there's a lot of food in the world today that can support our population, and it's because of the Green Revolution. And then just think of all the breakthroughs that we've had in medicine, new vaccines, new antibiotics that are helping people cure people of diseases. They're helping us live longer. Life expectancy has continued to grow through the 20th century. And of course, that's going to help the population as well. But then when you think about medicine, you also have to consider birth control. Like the birth control pill that becomes popular in the mid 20th century, it gives women a lot more control over their fertility. I'm not saying you get to decide when you have a baby and when you don't, because still we don't have complete control over that, of course. But it does give some measure of control to that. And so because of birth control, you actually see the fertility rate declining through the 20th century, i.e. the number of babies that women are having. You actually see kind of families having less kids. But because life expectancy is going up so much, the world's population is continuing to increase. All right, so we see all these amazing new technologies, and they are fantastic, and they make our lives so much easier. Believe me, you'd rather be living in 2020 than in 1900, okay? Things are a lot cleaner, they're a lot better. But that, of course, doesn't mean everything is perfect, and we know that right now because we are living through this. There are still limitations to technology that we need to consider. First off, when it comes to diseases, we still see certain diseases that are kind of synonymous with areas of poverty. Consider poorer areas of the world. Usually there's not clean water, clean air is usually an issue. People are living in very close quarters. And that's generally where we see diseases like malaria or tuberculosis growing. And that continues throughout the 20th century. Hey, continues. It's almost like that's a continuity. Ah, that's right. We're talking about changes in continuities today. Don't forget. But we also see an increase in cases of some diseases because people are living longer lives. Consider heart disease. Heart disease is something that usually is found in the older populations. Not always, but typically speaking. Because people are living longer into their 80s and 90s, heart issues are becoming a bigger problem. Part of it's because people are living longer, although let's be honest, I think part of it's also because our diets are, especially here in the West, kind of crap these days. I mean, maybe it's because you're stuck in a house for 2 weeks with 2 little kids, and every day for lunch they want Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, and finally you just give in because you just want peace and quiet. That's not my case, of course. My children are perfect. I'm talking about other people and other people's children, of course. But the point is, heart disease is an issue. Alzheimer's is another disease that typically affects older populations. You don't see that many cases of Alzheimer's before 1900 because people weren't living long enough oftentimes to develop it. Or in some cases, just because doctors weren't able to identify it. These days, the identification process for it is a lot better too, so we're also seeing more cases. But the other part of disease we have got to talk about is global pandemics. And yes, I know that you're probably tired of hearing about global pandemics, but we need to realize that it is still an issue. But I want you to consider the outbreak of influenza in 1918. It's oftentimes referred to as the Spanish flu, and you've probably seen it referenced in news stories over the last couple of weeks. By the way, I would highly encourage you to look more into it because it really is a very interesting case study, and you can see a lot of similarities between what happened in 1918 and what's going on now. In fact, in the Google Drive, and the link to that is right below in the section about the video, I put an article in there about the Spanish flu. Highly recommend when you get a chance to read it. But that began in 1918 and kind of continued into 1919. But consider the historical context of that. It's right at the end of World War I. Soldiers are returning home from battlefields in Europe. Because remember, in World War I, yes, there were a lot of people in Europe fighting, but all those European countries had colonies all over the world. And a lot of those colonies sent soldiers to fight in Europe during World War I, or the United States also sent soldiers into Europe. And now that the war is over, they're all returning back to their homes, and they're taking that disease with them throughout the world. And this is probably the last time that we saw a global pandemic, of course, up until now, but it is an important one you need to know about. And if you look there on the right side of my slide, this is a poster that got placed all through Chicago. And you can see here, talking about theater, that's closed to people who have a cold and who are coughing. This was kind of social distancing 100 years ago. But as you read about it, you're going to see a lot of similarities to what we're facing today. I keep saying there's a lot of similarities between COVID-19 and the 1918 influenza outbreak. I wonder what we should do next. Hey, I know. Why don't we compare and contrast them? And what better way to compare and contrast their old friend, the Venn diagram? All right, take a second, look through what I've written here. I'll give you a little bit of time to read it. If you notice, I identified a few similarities and differences, but I kept them kind of broad. Because the problem with comparing and contrasting influenza in 1918 with COVID-19 is that we honestly don't know the full story of COVID-19. The story has not been written yet. We are in the middle of this. Historians always had that problem of trying to write history in the middle of the event, and it's very difficult to do. So I'm putting some of these things down, but realize, of course, they could change in the next couple of months. So I tried to keep it as broad as I possibly could. If you were writing an essay that had to compare and contrast these two, obviously you'd be a lot more specific. You would give more specific examples. But since we're living through this history right now, I thought it best to kind of keep it broad. And by the way, when I say we're living through history, we're living through history right now, everybody. I mean, we've said that before, but this is a major event that we're going through right now. I mean, just take a moment and consider 30 years from now. It's the year 2050. So in the next 30 years, all of y'all are going to graduate high school. You're going to go on to college, graduate college, get a good job. A lot of you are going to find that man or woman of your dreams. You're going to settle down, you're going to get married, you're going to have kids. And by the time we get to 2050, your kids are going to be in high school. They're going to be sitting in those same desks that you sit in at your school. And I'll probably still be teaching in the same school, in the same room. Hey guys, shout out to Pflugerville High. I'll be an F200 still. And yes, it'll be 30 years from now, so I'll probably be a little balder, well, more balder, fatter, but I'll still be there teaching, right? And when I get to this topic, I'm going to be teaching your kids about COVID-19. It is going to be in the history books, no doubt about it. So just keep that in mind. We often say we're living through history, but we are really doing that right now. And y'all probably realized that over the last couple of weeks. Okay, but anyway, enough of my history rant. Let's talk about similarities and differences here. Remember what Smith said the other day, that similarities and differences, when you come to those differences, they have to sort of line up. And if you notice here, each of my differences kind of did. For the Spanish flu, I said spread through soldiers returning home after World War I. COVID-19, though, really spread through more just our regular international travel. It wasn't that there was this big migration of people from one part of the world to another that spread this disease. It's just that these days, people are constantly traveling around the world. Again, international travel is not that expensive anymore. I may know that plane tickets to go to another country are expensive, but they're within the budget of a lot of people. And we see that because we see people traveling around the world. If we think about news of the epidemic, when it came to the influenza outbreak in 1918, people didn't quite realize what was going on at first because you had outbreaks here and you had outbreaks here in another country and another continent over here. But the news about it, no one ever kind of put that all together. Whereas with COVID-19, everyone around the world figured this out within a couple of months. So news is spreading a lot quicker. But again, we've got radio, we've got television, we've got the internet. That's going to help spread news of a disease like this much quicker. Also, because communication's better, doctors were able to identify COVID-19 a lot quicker than doctors were in 1918 with the Spanish flu. Now, yes, we're still struggling to figure out and have really good tests, and we're struggling to figure out vaccines, and hopefully that happens really soon. But as far as identification of it goes, it happened much, much quicker. But when you think about the similarities, both these diseases, I mean, let's be honest, and I hate to bring this up, but they're going to have large fatality rates. The Spanish flu of 1918 worldwide killed somewhere around 50 million people. Now, I don't think COVID-19 is going to do that. I really hope we get this under control soon. But we're already seeing the death rate growing through this. And for both of these, they had huge negative impacts on the economy. We've already seen here in the United States, the unemployment rate just skyrocketing over the last couple of weeks as businesses are shut down. But what you have to remember, and actually Smith is going to get into this a little bit more tomorrow, so I don't want to go too far into it. But because the world has shrunk through the internet and communication, transportation, all that, the global economy is more interconnected today than it ever has been before. So if there's an economic slowdown in one part of the world, it's going to affect all parts of the world. So believe me, these economic impacts of this are going to continue for a while now. And I hate to say that, but hopefully I'm wrong on this, but I'm afraid it's going to continue. All right, so notice here in the graph, I sort of identified several similarities and differences. But like I told y'all, it's not quite enough just to identify them. You have to be able to explain the reason why that similarity or difference occurred. So for me, I kind of already mentioned this when I was talking about it, but I put down here at the bottom, knowledge of the spread of the disease was much quicker. We found out about this a lot faster today because of advancements in technology and communication, mass media, the internet, things like that. Now, one other thing that I want to point out with all my similarities and differences, and also with the explanation, they're all related to historical themes. And that's very important because, by the way, you're in a history class, okay? Notice that I did not talk about the molecular structure of influenza versus coronavirus, because to be honest, I don't know anything about that. I know there's a difference between influenza and the coronavirus, but I can't explain it to you. It's a good thing you have biology teachers at your school that can. But make sure that you're focused on the major historical themes of this course. And I hope that at some point during the year, your teacher shared this with you. If they didn't, here you are right now. These are the major themes that you've been studying throughout the year. Maybe your teacher never quite showed it to you like this, but I promise you, you have looked at all these different topics through the year. So when you're coming up with similarities and differences, or as we'll see in a second, continuities and changes, make sure that you're hitting these main themes. You want to make sure that you're talking about historical topics. All right, the other big limitation or drawback, however you want to call it, for technology in 20th century is, of course, the impact on our environment. Okay, we talked about the Green Revolution, more crops being grown. Obviously, that means more food. That, of course, is a good thing. But it has led to some drawbacks as well. We have seen deforestation, forests and trees being chopped down. We've seen desertification also. Deserts around the world are beginning to grow because if you're farming a certain piece of land and you're farming it over and over again every season, eventually the soil begins to break down and blow away, and you're left with a barren area, with a desert. Now, you're of course familiar with air and water pollution. And by the way, we saw that back in the 1800s at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, do you know how nasty cities were in Europe after industry came in? It was disgusting. But it gets worse in the 20th century as industry begins to expand around the world. Because remember, if we go back to the 19th century, to the 1800s, the only areas of the world where we really see heavy industrialization are Europe, the United States, and Japan. And Japan's not even until the end of the 1800s after the Meiji Restoration. But in the 20th century, we see industry around the world. And so air and water pollution of course, become huge problems. Now, fortunately, a lot of governments have passed very strong regulations to make sure that air and water get cleaned up, and things are probably better on that front than they were in past years in the 20th century in most parts of the world. But there are still parts of the world where it is a big issue, no doubt about it. But I think the biggest issue when you consider the environment is, of course, global man-made climate change. And I know you're familiar with it. I know you've studied it before, so we don't need to get into too much detail about it. But I want you to kind of think about it from a world history perspective. Climate change is no doubt a global problem. This is not something that one country can just fix on its own. It is a global problem that every country around the world needs to pitch in to help out with. And that's kind of the issue with it. It's what makes it such a problem. Is that how do you get every country around the world to chip in and help find a solution? That's a difficult thing to do. So again, when we think about climate change, also keep in mind global political structures we have like the United Nations. And again, Smith is going to get into that a little bit tomorrow, so I don't want to get too far ahead of what he's going to talk about. But realize that there has to be a global solution of some point to climate change. It's not just one country or two countries that are going to be able to make solve this problem. Okay, so we already did a little bit of comparing and contrasting. Now it's your time to do some continuities and changes. So here's what you do. Get a blank sheet of paper if you have it, or if you want to have a word processor going there on the side, something like that. And I want you to think about the new technologies that we saw in the 20th century. And I gave you those categories we talked about at the beginning. So pick one: communication, energy, agriculture, or medicine. And I want you to come up with at least one continuity and at least one change that we see in the 20th century because of these new technologies. If you can do two continuities and two changes, that would be best, but at least one of each. And I also want you to think about the reason for those continuities and those changes. So let's take about 4 or 5 minutes or so, come up with at least one continuity and change, preferably two, and the reasons for that. And then we'll come back together and I'll share a couple of answers that I came up with. All right, ready? Go. All right, take about 3 more minutes. Again, make sure you've identified some continuities and changes, and then do your analysis. Think about your reasons why those continuities or changes occurred. All right, take about 2 more minutes. At this point, you should be able to at least identify a couple continuities and changes, but now take a second and do that analysis, the reason for it, which gets a little tougher. All right, 1 more minute. Coming up with a reason for a change is often a lot easier than coming up with a reason for a continuity. To come up with a reason for a continuity, you got to talk about really what has not changed and why has it not changed. Usually with a change, it's pretty easy to figure out the reason why. There's usually some kind of event or moment that changes things. All right, so let's talk about a couple that you could come up with. I decided to focus on atomic and nuclear power. And so I said that it led to new sources of energy and more energy for humans to harness. Again, the amount of energy that we have today is much, much more than we've ever had through human history, even with the steam engine or before that with human and animal power. All right, but a continuity. If you think about transportation in the early 20th century versus today, we still rely on combustion engines, car engines that run on oil and gas. We rely on that for transportation of ourselves by still driving ourselves places and for the movement of goods. I mean, now that we can't leave the house, how much stuff have you gotten delivered from Amazon these last couple of weeks? That's getting delivered in really big trucks and vans. So then you got to ask yourself, why? Why is it that we're still relying on combustion engines? And there's a lot of different reasons that you could go into, but the bottom line is that oil around the world, there's still a lot of it underground. And we're always coming up with new ways to find more oil underground, like fracking and things like that. And you can talk about the drawbacks of that. And yes, there are plenty. But the bottom line is there's still plenty of oil. And to refine it and turn it into gasoline is still fairly cheap process. If you think about renewable technologies, think about cars that run on solar power or on electricity. Yes, those are there and they're starting to become more popular. But right now, those technologies are just simply not efficient enough, or in some cases, cheap enough for everybody to afford. And yes, it'd be great over the next 15, 20 years if that's no longer the case. But we have to think about the limitations of technology, like we talked about earlier. All right, so let's kind of summarize things real quick. We talked about advancements in communication, transportation, medicine, all of that. We talked about the drawbacks and limitations of it. But then here's what I really want to focus on here is making those connections between historical events and processes. So talking about continuities and changes or similarities and differences. And by the way, if you can start thinking in those terms, it is going to help you so much on the AP test. Okay, consider for a second. You're going to start studying for this AP test. There's a lot that you have to know. Guys, y'all have learned a lot of history over this year. And yes, this year's AP test, as you've heard, is going to stop in 1900, but you still have to know everything from 1200 to 1900. There's a lot of information there from around the world. So how are you going to organize all that in your head? Because I'm telling you right now, you probably don't want to sit there and just say, okay, I'm going to start reading my textbook from page 1, or I'm going to start looking at the notes that my teacher gave me on the first day and go up until, what we did in March. Instead, start taking that information and organizing it around continuities and changes, similarities and differences, and also causes and effects. And it's going to make your studying so much easier and so much more efficient. Think about it like this way. I'm always kind of jealous of physics teachers because physics has these certain laws that never change. An object in motion stays at motion. An object at rest stays at rest. That's easy to learn. If an object's sitting there, it's not going to move. We know that to be true. History is a lot messier. We don't have those universal laws that are always true. But we can start looking at these connections between events and make laws that are mostly true. So for example, let's think about the spread of diseases. We know in history, oftentimes when people move from one area to another, if there's a mass migration of people, or if trade increases along a certain route, that disease is going to spread. The Bubonic Plague spread across trade routes across Europe and Asia, mainly due to kind of the Mongol influence and increasing trade there. When Europeans arrived in the Americas after the discovery in 1492, they brought smallpox, and we know about the effects there. We just again talked today about the 1918 influenza. Soldiers are leaving the war, World War I, and they're headed back home, and diseases are spreaded that way. So if you understand that idea of, hey, when large groups of people move, diseases often spread, well, then that helps you to organize all the information. Now you can study the Bubonic Plague and the spread of smallpox to the Americas and the 1918 influenza epidemic. Study those together because you're going to see a lot of similarities across them. And again, it's going to make your studying so much easier and so much more efficient. So instead of just trying to memorize facts about every sentence together in these connections. All right. Got a little homework for tonight that Mr. Smith is going to go over with you tomorrow. I've got a short answer question here. So you don't need to start working on it right now, but I'm going to kind of pause here for a second. Obviously, return to this video later to work on it, but just make sure you get it done by tomorrow's session. And this is a short answer question with 3 parts about the environmental history of the 20th century that we got into a little bit today. All right, thank you so much. I actually have one more announcement before I go. Tomorrow's session with Mr. Smith is a very, very important one. You need to tune in and watch because, in case you're not aware, tomorrow, the College Board is going to release all the details on this year's AP test. You already know that the AP test is going to be shortened down this year. You're going to be able to take it from home, but tomorrow they're going to release details of exactly what that's going to look like. And so in tomorrow's session, Mr. Smith is going to go over that with you. So please, please, please tune in, make sure you watch. If you have any questions about it, talk to your AP teacher either tomorrow or on Monday, because you need to know exactly what's going on with this test. It is going to be different than other AP tests in the past. And by the way, if you're taking any other AP classes, make sure you watch those review sessions tomorrow as well. All right, so Smith will be here with y'all tomorrow. I will see y'all on Monday. So I'm not going to see you again. Have a nice weekend, but we'll talk on Monday. Good night, everybody.